The complete works of Swami Vivekananda, The Sages of India, Part 1. In speaking of the sages of India, my mind goes back to those periods of which history has no record, and tradition tries in vain to bring out the secrets out of the gloom of the past. The sages of India have been almost innumerable, for what has been the Hindu nation been doing for thousands of years, except producing sages? I will take therefore the lives of a few of the most brilliant ones, the epoch makers, and present them before you, that is to say, my study of them. In the first place, we have to understand a little bit about our scriptures. Two ideals of truth are in our scriptures. The one is what we call the eternal, and the other is the not so authoritative, yet binding under particular circumstances, particular times, and particular places. The eternal relations which deal with the nature of the soul and of God, and the relations between the souls and the God, are embodied in what we call the Shrutis, the Vedas. The next set of truths is what we call the Smritis, as embodied in the words of Manu, Yajnavalkya, and the other writers, and also in the Puranas down to the Tantras. The second class of books and teachings is subordinate to the Shrutis, inasmuch as whenever any one of these contradicts anything in the Shrutis must prevail. This is the law. The idea is that the framework of the destiny and goal of man has been delineated in the Vedas. The details have been left to be worked out in the Smritis and in the Puranas. As for general directions, the Shrutis are enough. For spiritual life, nothing more can be said. Nothing more can be known. All that is necessary has been known. All the advice that is necessary to lead the soul to perfection has been completed in the Shrutis. The details alone were left out, and these the Smritis have supplied from time to time. Another peculiarity is that these Shrutis have many sages as the recorders of the truth, in them mostly men, some even women. Very little is known of their personalities, the dates of their birth, and so forth. But their best thoughts, their best discoveries, I should say, are preserved there, embodied in the sacred literature of our country, the Vedas. In the Smritis, on the other hand, the personalities are more in evidence. Startling, gigantic, impressive, world-moving persons stand before us, as it were, for the first time, sometimes of more magnitude even than their teachings. This is a peculiarity which we have to understand, that our religion preaches an impersonal, personal God. It preaches any amount of impersonal laws plus any amount of personality. But the very foundation head of our religion is in the Shrutis. The Vedas, which are perfectly impersonal, the persons all come in the Smritis and in the Puranas, the great avatars, incarnations of God, prophets, and so forth. And this ought to be observed that except our religion, every other religion in the world depends upon the life or lives of some personal founder or founders. Christianity is built upon the life of Jesus Christ. Mohammedanism is built on Muhammad. Buddhism upon Buddha. Jainism upon the Jinnas, and so on. It naturally follows that there must be in all these religions a good deal of fight about what they call the historical evidence of these great personalities. If at any time the historical evidences about the existence of these personages in ancient times becomes weak, then the whole building of the religion tumbles down and it breaks into pieces. We escape this fact because our religion is not based upon persons, but is based upon principles. That you obey your religion is not because it came through the authority of a sage, no, not even an incarnation. Krishna is not the authority of the Vedas, but the Vedas are the authority of Krishna himself. His glory is that he is the greatest preacher of the Vedas that ever existed. So with the other incarnations, so with all our sages. Our first principle is that all that is necessary for the perfection of man and for attaining unto freedom is there in the Vedas. You cannot find anything new. You cannot go beyond a perfect unity, which is the goal of all knowledge. This has been already reached there, and it is impossible to go beyond the unity. Religious knowledge became complete when Tattvam Asi, thou art that, was discovered, and that was in the Vedas. What remained was the guidance of the people from time to time according to the different times and places, and also according to the different circumstances and environments that people had to be guided along the old path. And for this, these great teachers came. These great sages came. Nothing can bear out this more clearly than the celebrated saying of Sri Krishna in the Gita. Whenever virtue subsides and irreligion prevails, I create myself for the protection of the good, for the destruction of all immorality. I am coming from time to time. This is the idea of India. What follows? That on the one hand there are these eternal principles which stand upon their own foundations without depending on any reasoning, even much less on the authority of the sages, however great, of incarnations, however brilliant they may have been. We may remark that this is the unique position in India. Our claim is that the Vedanta can only be the universal religion, that it is already the existing universal religion of the world because it teaches principles and not persons. No religion built upon a person can take up as a type by all the races of mankind. In our country, we find that there has been so many grand characters. In even a small city, many persons are taken up as types of different minds in that one city. How is it possible that one person as Muhammad or Buddha or Christ can be taken up as the one type for the whole world? Nay, the whole of morality, ethics, spirituality, and religion can be true only from the sanction of that one person and that one person alone. Now, the Vedantic religion does not require any such personal authority. Its sanction is the eternal nature of man. Its ethics are based upon the eternal spiritual solidarity of man already existing, already attained and not to be attained. On the other hand, from the very earliest times, our sages have been feeling conscious of this fact, and the vast majority of mankind require a personality. They must have a personal God in some form or the other. The very Buddha who declared against the existence of a personal God had not died 50 years before his disciples manufactured a personal God out of him. The personal God is necessary, and at the same time we know that instead of and better than vain imaginations of a personal God, which is in 99 cases out of 100 are unworthy of human worship, we have in this world, living and walking in our midst, living gods every now and then. These are more worthy of worship than any imaginary God, any creation of our imagination, that is to say, any idea of God which we can form. Sri Krishna is much greater than any idea of God that you or I can have. Buddha is much greater idea, a more living and idealized idea than the ideal you and I can conceive in our minds. And therefore, it is that they always command the worship of mankind, even to the exclusion of all the imaginary deities.